The Olive Garden on 8 Mile Road wasn't exactly fine dining, but it had been Patricia and Michael Thompson's regular spot for Thursday night dinners for the past 15 years. At 62, Michael appreciated routine. The same booth by the window, the same order of chicken parmigiana, the same comfortable conversation about their day, their son David's latest promotion at the engineering firm, and their plans for retirement. What Michael didn't expect on this particular Thursday evening in March was for his wife of 35 years to casually destroy their marriage between the breadsticks and the main course. "Michael," Patricia said, twirling pasta around her fork with the same methodical precision she'd used for decades, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just accept it." Michael looked up from his chicken, noting the unusual tension in Patricia's voice. At 59, she was still an attractive woman. Her auburn hair showed only hints of grey, and her green eyes held the same intelligence that had first caught his attention at a UAW picnic in 1989. But tonight, something in her expression made him set down his fork. "What's on your mind, Patty?" Patricia glanced around the restaurant, as if checking to make sure no one from their Detroit neighborhood was within earshot. The gesture seemed odd. Patricia had never been particularly concerned about privacy during their casual dinner conversations. "It's about David," she said, and Michael felt his chest tighten. Their son was 34 years old, married with 2 children of his own, and working as a senior mechanical engineer for Ford Motor Company. David was Michael's pride and joy, the first person in the Thompson family to graduate from college, a man who'd inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's intelligence. "Is he okay? Is something wrong with the kids?" "No, nothing like that." Patricia took a sip of her wine, an unusual choice, since she typically stuck to iced tea during their Thursday dinners. "David is fine. It's just... Michael, you need to accept my paternity fraud." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He stared at his wife, certain he'd misheard her. The restaurant's background noise, clinking silverware, muted conversations, the soft jazz music, seemed to fade into silence. "What did you say?" Patricia's expression remained calm, almost businesslike. "I said you need to accept my paternity fraud about David. I've been thinking about this for months, and I've decided it's time to be honest." Michael felt the world tilt sideways. "Patty, what are you talking about?" "David isn't your biological son, Michael. He never was, but you've been a wonderful father to him, and I don't want that to change. I just need you to accept the situation and move forward." The casual tone of her confession was almost more shocking than the words themselves. Patricia spoke as if she were discussing a minor household repair or a change in their vacation plans, not revealing that their son, Michael's son, the boy he'd coached in Little League, taught to drive, walked down the aisle at his wedding, wasn't actually his child. Michael's hands began to shake. "You're telling me that David, that for 34 years... "That's right. But Michael, you have to understand. David doesn't know, and I don't want him to know. You're the only father he's ever known, and you're good at it. This doesn't have to change anything." Michael stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. The woman sitting across from him, calmly eating her fettuccine alfredo, while discussing the complete destruction of everything he thought he knew about his family, was a stranger. "Who?" The word came out as a whisper. "Who what? Who is David's father?" Patricia set down her fork and looked at Michael with something that might have been pity. "Does that really matter now? It was a long time ago, Michael. Ancient history." "Ancient history?" Michael's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. "You're talking about my son, about our marriage, about 35 years of lies, and you call it ancient history?" "Keep your voice down," Patricia said sharply. "People are looking." Michael looked around the restaurant and realized he didn't care who was looking. His entire life had just been revealed as a lie, and his wife was worried about causing a scene at the Olive Garden. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, forcing his voice back to a whisper. Patricia shrugged, as if the question were irrelevant. "Because I'm tired of carrying the secret, and because I know you well enough to know that you'll accept it and move on. You're not the type to blow up the family over something that happened decades ago." The casual cruelty of her assessment hit Michael like a slap. Patricia had calculated his response, had determined that he was too predictable, too conflict-averse, too invested in maintaining family stability to do anything but absorb this devastating news and continue pretending nothing had changed. "You think I'll just accept this?" "I know you will. Because the alternative is destroying David's life, and you love him too much to do that. You love our family too much to tear it apart over something that can't be changed." Michael felt tears threatening and fought them back. Around them, families were enjoying their Thursday night dinners, celebrating birthdays and anniversaries, living normal lives where the fundamental truths of their relationships weren't being casually demolished over breadsticks. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long have you been planning to tell me this?" Patricia considered the question as if it required careful thought. "About 6 months. Ever since David started talking about doing one of those ancestry DNA tests. You know how interested he's gotten in genealogy since the kids were born. I figured it was better to tell you now, before he accidentally discovers the truth on his own." The methodical way she'd planned this revelation made Michael's stomach turn. For 6 months, Patricia had been carrying on their normal routine. Their Thursday dinners, their weekend visits with David and his family, their discussions about retirement plans, all while knowing she was going to drop this bomb into the middle of their lives. "Have you told David?" "Of course not, and I'm not going to. That's the whole point, Michael. We accept the situation privately and continue being the family we've always been. David never has to know." "And you think that's fair to him, to me, to continue living this lie?" Patricia's expression hardened. "I think what's fair is protecting our son from information that would only hurt him. David worships you, Michael. You're his hero. Finding out you're not his biological father would destroy him." Michael thought about David, the phone calls every Sunday, the way he still asked for advice about work and parenting, the pride in his voice when he talked about following in his father's footsteps by working with his hands and building things that mattered. The idea of that relationship being built on a lie was almost unbearable. "Who else knows? Nobody. Just me. And now you. The father, does he know?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "That's not important. It's important to me." "Michael, I'm not going to discuss the details. What matters is that you and I figure out how to move forward from here." Michael looked at his wife, really looked at her, and tried to reconcile this cold, calculating woman with the person he'd thought he'd married. The Patricia he'd fallen in love with had been warm and spontaneous, quick to laugh and slow to anger. The woman sitting across from him was a stranger who'd been living in his house, sharing his bed, and lying to his face for over 3 decades. "I need some air," he said, standing up abruptly. "Michael, sit down. We need to finish this conversation." "No, we don't. Not here, not now." He walked out of the restaurant without another word, leaving Patricia sitting alone at their usual table. Outside, the March evening was cold and damp, typical Detroit weather that matched the chill settling into his chest. Michael sat in his pickup truck for 20 minutes, staring at the restaurant's neon sign and trying to process what had just happened. When he finally drove home to their small house in East Point, Patricia was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and an expression that suggested she'd been preparing for his return. "Are you ready to discuss this rationally?" she asked. Michael poured himself a glass of water and sat down across from her. "How long were you having the affair?" "Michael, how long?" Patricia sighed as if his questions were tedious. "About 6 months. It ended before David was born." "So you were cheating on me while you were pregnant with what I thought was my son?" "It wasn't like that. Our marriage was going through a rough patch. You were working double shifts, we barely saw each other, and I was lonely and scared about becoming a mother." Michael remembered that time, 1989 into 1990. He'd been working construction on the new GM plant in Hamtramck, pulling 12-hour days and weekend overtime to save money for the baby. He'd thought he was being a responsible husband and father-to-be, providing for his growing family. "So, you decided to have an affair instead of talking to me about how you were feeling?" "I made a mistake, Michael, a terrible mistake. But David is the result of that mistake, and he's the best thing that ever happened to us. Are you really going to let my error in judgment destroy our family?" The way Patricia framed the situation, as if Michael's reaction to her deception was the problem rather than the deception itself, made his anger flare. "You didn't make an error in judgment, Patty. You made a choice. You chose to cheat on your husband. You chose to let me believe David was my son. You chose to lie to me for 34 years. And now you're choosing to tell me in the most casual way possible, like you're discussing the weather. I told you because I respect our marriage too much to keep lying." Michael stared at her in disbelief. "You respect our marriage. Our marriage has been a lie for 3 decades. That's not true. David may not be your biological son, but everything else has been real. Our love, our partnership, the family we've built together. One mistake doesn't erase 35 years of marriage." Michael stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the small backyard where he'd taught David to throw a baseball, where they'd built a treehouse together, where they'd spent countless evenings grilling dinner and talking about David's dreams for the future. "Does he look like his biological father?" Michael asked quietly. Patricia was silent for so long that Michael turned around to look at her. She was staring at her hands, and for the first time since her confession, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Patricia, does David look like his biological father?" "Yes," she said finally. "He does." Michael felt something break inside his chest. David had Patricia's green eyes, but his facial structure, his build, his mannerisms, Michael had always assumed those came from his own family. Now he realized that David's features, the ones that didn't match either Patricia or Michael, belonged to a man Michael had never met. "I want a DNA test," Michael said. "Absolutely not." "It's not your choice, Patty. If you're telling me the truth, then the test will confirm it. If you're lying, I'm not lying. But getting a DNA test means involving David, and I won't let you do that to him. Then I'll get one done privately. There are ways to do that." Patricia stood up, her composure finally cracking. "Michael, if you pursue this, if you do anything to disrupt David's life, I will never forgive you. And if I find out you've been lying about other things, I'll never forgive you." They stared at each other across the kitchen, where they'd shared thousands of meals, made countless plans, and raised the son who might not be Michael's biological child. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. "I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight," Michael said finally. "Michael, I need time to think, and I need space to figure out what I'm going to do next." As Michael lay awake in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the house he'd lived in for 28 years, he thought about David. His son, biological or not, was a good man with a wife and children who loved him. David had built a successful career, owned his own home, and seemed genuinely happy with his life. But that happiness was built on a lie, and now Michael had to decide whether to preserve that lie or pursue the truth, regardless of the consequences. By morning, he'd made his decision. Michael Thompson had spent his entire life believing that honesty was the foundation of any meaningful relationship. He wasn't going to start compromising that principle now, even if it meant losing everything he thought he'd built, with the woman sleeping in the next room. Patricia might be willing to live with deception, but Michael wasn't. And if that meant their marriage couldn't survive the truth, then maybe their marriage hadn't been worth saving in the first place. The investigation into his own life was about to begin. Michael Thompson had never considered himself a detective, but 38 years in construction had taught him how to approach complex problems systematically. You started with the foundation, examined the supporting structures, and followed the evidence until you understood how everything fit together. His marriage, he was beginning to realize, had some serious structural problems that needed immediate attention. The morning after Patricia's confession, Michael sat in his pickup truck outside the East Point Public Library, drinking coffee from a thermos and planning his investigation. At 62, he wasn't particularly comfortable with computers, but he knew enough to understand that most information could be found online if you knew where to look. The librarian, a patient woman in her 30s named Sarah, helped him navigate the genealogy databases and public records websites. Michael had told her he was researching his family history, which was true, even if his motivations weren't entirely academic. "These ancestry sites can be really helpful," Sarah said, showing him how to search birth records and marriage certificates. "And if you're looking for more recent information, social media can sometimes fill in gaps that official records don't cover." Michael spent 4 hours that first day learning about Patricia's life in the year leading up to David's birth. He found her employment records from the insurance office where she'd worked, her medical records from David's birth, and even some newspaper clippings from social events she'd attended. What he didn't find was any obvious sign of another relationship. But Michael had learned during his construction career that the most important clues were often the ones that weren't immediately visible. You had to know where to look, and you had to be patient enough to keep digging until you found the truth. Over the next week, Michael developed a routine. He'd leave the house each morning as if he were running errands, spend the day at the library or driving around Detroit, following leads and gathering information. Patricia seemed content to pretend their marriage hadn't fundamentally changed, continuing her normal activities and making conversation about David's family and their weekend plans. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Michael was looking through Patricia's high school yearbooks, trying to identify men she might have reconnected with during their early marriage. He found something that made his blood run cold. A wedding announcement from the Detroit Free Press, dated June 1991, featuring Patricia's maid of honor from their own wedding. The announcement was for Angela Martinez, Patricia's closest friend from their insurance office days. But what caught Michael's attention wasn't Angela's marriage. It was the wedding party photograph that accompanied the article. Standing behind the bride was Patricia, smiling broadly, and next to her was a man Michael didn't recognize. The caption identified him as James Kellerman, best man. Michael stared at the photograph for a long time. James Kellerman was tall and lean, with dark hair and the kind of strong jawline that Michael now realized he'd been seeing in David's face for 34 years. The resemblance was unmistakable, once you knew to look for it. That evening, Michael approached Patricia as she was preparing dinner. "Who is James Kellerman?" he asked without preamble. Patricia's hands stilled on the cutting board where she'd been chopping vegetables for their salad. She didn't turn around, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Angela Martinez's wedding, June 1991. You were the maid of honor, and James Kellerman was the best man. There's a photograph in the Detroit Free Press archives." Patricia set down her knife and turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Michael had been married to her long enough to recognize the signs of someone preparing to lie. That was Angela's wedding. I barely knew James Kellerman, but you knew him well enough to pose for photographs with him. Michael, what are you trying to accomplish here? I told you the truth about David. Digging into ancient history isn't going to change anything. Ancient history seems to be having a lot of impact on our current situation. Patricia walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of wine, another unusual choice for a weeknight. Michael watched as she poured herself a large glass, noting that her hands were shaking slightly. James Kellerman was Angela's brother-in-law, she said finally. He was married to Angela's sister, Lisa. They lived in Toledo, and I met him a few times at family gatherings. Was he David's father? Patricia took a large sip of wine before answering. Yes. The simple admission hit Michael like a punch to the gut, even though he'd been expecting it. Hearing Patricia confirm that David's father was a man Michael had never met, a man who'd been part of their extended social circle while Patricia was pregnant, made the betrayal feel fresh and immediate. Was he married when you were having the affair? Yes. Did his wife know? Patricia's expression hardened. Lisa died in a car accident in 1993. James moved to Florida after that. I haven't had contact with him in over 20 years. Michael sat down at the kitchen table processing this information. David's biological father was a man named James Kellerman who'd lived in Toledo, whose wife had died 2 years after David's birth, and who'd disappeared to Florida sometime in the early 1990s. The affair had taken place while both Michael and James were married, destroying at least 2 families in the process. Does David know any of this? About Angela's family? About the connection? Angela moved to California years ago. David's never met any of her relatives. Michael looked at his wife, trying to understand how she'd managed to compartmentalize this information for so long. How did you do it, Patty? How did you look at me every day, knowing that David wasn't my son, and act like nothing was wrong? Patricia finished her wine and poured another glass. Because David needed a father, and you were good at being one. Because our marriage was worth saving, and dwelling on one mistake would have destroyed everything we'd built together. One mistake? You call a 6-month affair that resulted in a child one mistake? I call it a period of poor judgment that I've regretted every day since. But Michael, look at what came from it. David is an incredible man. He's successful, he's happy, he's got a beautiful family. Would you really want to undo all of that? Michael stood up and walked to the kitchen window, the same spot where he'd stood the night of Patricia's confession. In the fading daylight, he could see the basketball hoop he'd installed for David when the boy was 8 years old, the vegetable garden they'd planted together every spring, the deck where they'd celebrated David's high school graduation. I need to know if there are other lies, Michael said quietly. What do you mean? I mean that if you were capable of lying about David's paternity for 34 years, I have to wonder what else you've been lying about. Patricia's voice turned cold. I haven't lied about anything else, Michael. This was one situation, one mistake, and I handled it the way I thought was best for everyone involved. By lying to your husband for 3 decades. By protecting our family from information that would only cause pain. Michael turned back to face his wife. I want to contact James Kellerman. Absolutely not. Why? If he's David's father, he has a right to know he has a son. Patricia slammed her wineglass down on the counter hard enough that some of the liquid sloshed out. Because James Kellerman is a stranger who has no place in our family. Because David doesn't need another father figure in his life. Because you have no right to disrupt people's lives based on something that happened over 30 years ago. And you had no right to lie to me for 30 years about who fathered our son. David is our son, Michael. Biologically, he might be James Kellerman's child, but in every way that matters, he's ours. You're the one who taught him to ride a bike, who helped him with his math homework, who walked him down the aisle at his wedding. James Kellerman is just a man who contributed DNA. Michael had to admit that Patricia's argument had some merit. He'd been David's father in every meaningful sense for 34 years, but the knowledge that this relationship was built on deception poisoned everything he'd thought he understood about his family. "I'm going to find him anyway," Michael said. Patricia stared at him for a long moment, and Michael could see her calculating her response. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If you're determined to do this, then I can't stop you. But Michael, I need you to understand that whatever you discover, whatever James Kellerman tells you, it won't change the fact that David is our son and you are his father. The only thing this investigation will accomplish is satisfying your need to know details that won't improve anyone's life." Michael looked at his wife, this woman who'd shared his bed and his life for 35 years, and realized that they were looking at the same situation from completely different perspectives. Patricia saw their marriage as something that had survived a mistake and become stronger. Michael saw it as something built on a foundation of lies that had finally been exposed. That night, Michael began his search for James Kellerman in earnest. The internet made it surprisingly easy to track down basic information about people, especially if you had a starting point like a name and a former city of residence. James Kellerman had indeed moved to Florida, specifically to Tampa, where he'd worked as an electrical contractor until his retirement in 2018. He'd never remarried after his wife Lisa's death, had no other children according to public records, and lived alone in a small house near the Gulf Coast. Most importantly, James Kellerman was still alive, still living at the same address, and still reachable by phone. Michael stared at the phone number on his computer screen for 20 minutes before finally picking up his cell phone and dialing. The conversation that followed would either provide the answers he needed or complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The phone rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Hello? Is this James Kellerman?" "Yeah, who's asking?" Michael took a deep breath. "My name is Michael Thompson. I'm calling from Detroit. I think you might have known my wife, Patricia, back in the early 1990s. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Michael wondered if James had hung up. "Patricia Thompson," James said finally, and his voice carried a note of recognition that made Michael's stomach clench. "How did you find me? We need to talk." The silence on the phone stretched for what felt like an eternity before James Kellerman spoke again, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "I wondered if this day would ever come," James said quietly. 34 years is a long time to carry a secret." Michael felt his heart racing. "So you know about David?" "I know I have a son I've never met, if that's what you're asking. Patricia told me she was pregnant right before Lisa died. Said the baby was mine, but that she was going to raise him with you, and I should stay out of the picture." Michael sank into his kitchen chair, processing this revelation. Not only had Patricia lied to him for decades, but she'd also denied James Kellerman the opportunity to know his biological son. "Did you want to be involved?" Michael asked. James was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Thompson, I was dealing with my wife's death, trying to figure out how to keep living after losing the woman I'd planned to spend my life with. When Patricia told me about the pregnancy, I was in no shape to be a father to anyone. Maybe that was cowardly, but it was honest. But later, as David got older, I convinced myself that Patricia had made the right choice. The boy had a good father, a stable home. What was I going to do? Show up and destroy his family to satisfy my own curiosity?" Michael found himself having an unexpected moment of sympathy for James Kellerman. The man had made a terrible mistake by having an affair with Patricia, But at least he'd tried to do the right thing afterward by staying away. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right. Was the affair just those 6 months, or was there more to it? Another long pause. Mr. Thompson, I think this conversation needs to happen in person. There are things you need to know, things that are too complicated to discuss over the phone. Michael felt his stomach drop. What kind of things? The kind of things that might change how you see your whole marriage. Can you come to Florida? 2 days later, Michael was on a plane to Tampa, having told Patricia he was going to visit his brother in Cleveland. Another lie to add to the growing collection that seemed to define their relationship. The flight gave him time to think about what James might tell him, and none of his imaginings were reassuring. James Kellerman lived in a modest ranch house about 10 minutes from Tampa Bay, with a small front yard, dominated by palm trees, and the kind of practical landscaping that suggested someone who valued simplicity over appearances. When he answered the door, Michael was struck by how much David resembled this stranger. The same jawline, the same build, even the same way of standing with his weight slightly shifted to one foot. "You must be Michael," James said, extending his hand. "Come in. I've got coffee made." James was 71 years old, retired for 6 years, and living the quiet life of a man who'd made his peace with solitude. His house was clean but sparse, decorated with photographs of what Michael assumed was his deceased wife, and a few pictures of fishing trips and construction projects. "I have to say," James said as they sat down in his living room, "you're taking this better than I expected. If someone had called me about my wife having an affair, I probably would have come down here looking for a fight." "The day is young," Michael said, accepting a cup of coffee. "But I need to understand what happened before I decide how angry to be." James nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Anger without information is just destructive. So tell me what I need to know." James set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair. "The affair with Patricia wasn't 6 months, Michael. It was 2.5 years. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. 2.5 years? It started in late 1987, about a year after you and Patricia were married. It ended when she told me she was pregnant in early 1990. Michael did the math quickly. David had been born in September 1990, which meant Patricia had been having an affair for most of the first 3 years of their marriage. She'd been cheating on him while they were newlyweds, while they were trying to start a family, while Michael was working extra shifts to pay for the house they'd bought together. "How?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was doing electrical work for the insurance company where Patricia worked. We met when I was upgrading their office systems and—" James shrugged helplessly. "I was in a bad marriage. She said she was lonely, and we made terrible choices that hurt everyone involved. She said she was lonely. She said you worked all the time, that you were more interested in providing for the future than paying attention to what was happening in the present. I'm not saying that justified what we did, but that was her explanation." Michael thought about those early years of his marriage. He had been working constantly, trying to establish himself in the construction industry, trying to build the kind of financial stability that would allow him and Patricia to have the family they'd talked about. He'd thought he was being a good husband by working hard to secure their future. "Where did you meet? How did you manage to carry on a relationship for 2.5 years without me knowing?" James looked uncomfortable. "Lunch hours, mostly. Sometimes evenings when you were working late. A few times we went out of town for weekends when you thought Patricia was visiting her sister in Grand Rapids." Michael felt sick. "Her sister confirmed those trips. I called her once when Patricia didn't answer her hotel phone. Patricia's sister knew about the affair. She covered for her." The revelation that Patricia's family had been complicit in the deception made Michael's betrayal feel even more complete. It wasn't just his wife who'd been lying to him. It was an entire network of people who'd decided that Michael Thompson was too naive or too trusting to deserve the truth about his own life. "Did you love her?" Michael asked. James was quiet for a long time. "I thought I did, but looking back, I think I was just unhappy in my own marriage, and Patricia represented escape from that unhappiness. When Lisa died, when I had to face real loss and real grief, I realized that what Patricia and I had wasn't love. It was just two people using each other to avoid dealing with their real problems. And when she got pregnant, she told me there was a chance the baby was mine, but she wasn't certain. She said she was going to end the affair and try to make her marriage work, and that she thought it was better for everyone if you believed the baby was yours." Michael set down his coffee cup because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. "Did you believe her about not being certain?" James met Michael's eyes directly. "No, the timing made it pretty clear that David was mine, but Patricia was convinced that you'd be a better father than I would, and honestly, she was probably right. I was a mess after Lisa's death. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone raise a child." But you never tried to find out for sure, never tried to see David." "I thought about it, especially after I moved to Florida and got my life together. But by then, David was a teenager with a father he loved and a family that worked. What right did I have to disrupt that?" Michael stood up and walked to James's front window, looking out at the palm trees and the unfamiliar Florida landscape. "What right did Patricia have to make that decision for all of us? For you, for me, for David?" "None," James said simply. "But she did it anyway, and we all lived with the consequences." Michael turned back to face James. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay. Do you want to meet David?" James was quiet for so long that Michael thought he might not answer at all. "Every day for 34 years, James said finally. "But I want what's best for him more than I want what I think might make me happy, and I'm not sure disrupting his life now is what's best for him." Michael sat back down, studying this man who was David's biological father. James Kellerman was thoughtful and careful, someone who'd made a terrible mistake but had spent decades trying to minimize the damage that mistake caused to other people. In some ways, he was more honorable than Patricia, who'd made unilateral decisions about everyone's lives and then expected them to accept those decisions without question. "James, can I tell you about David?" "I'd like that." For the next 2 hours, Michael told James about his son, about David's childhood, his academic achievements, his career at Ford, his marriage to a wonderful woman named Sarah, his 2 children who called Michael Grandpa and brought him more joy than he'd ever imagined possible. Michael showed James photographs on his phone, shared stories about David's sense of humor and his integrity and his determination to build things that mattered. By the time Michael finished, James had tears in his eyes. "He sounds like everything a father could want in a son," James said. "He is, and that's why this is so hard. I've been his father for 34 years, and I love him more than my own life. But knowing that our relationship is built on a lie changes something fundamental about how I see myself, how I see my marriage, how I see our family." James nodded. "What are you going to do?" Michael had been wrestling with that question for 2 weeks, and he still didn't have a good answer. "I don't know. Tell David the truth and risk destroying his relationship with his mother? Keep Patricia's secret and continue living a lie? Ask you to stay out of our lives or give you the chance to meet the son you've never known? Those are impossible choices. Yeah, they are. And Patricia made them impossible by lying for 34 years instead of dealing with the situation honestly when it happened." Michael stood up to leave, but James stopped him with a question. "Michael, can I ask you something?" Sure. Do you think David would want to know, not about the affair, not about the lies, but about having a biological father who spent his entire life wondering about him? Michael thought about David's recent interest in genealogy, his fascination with family history, his desire to understand where his children's traits and talents came from. David was a man who valued truth and honesty above almost everything else, qualities he'd learned from Michael, ironically enough. Yes, Michael said finally, I think he would want to know. Then maybe the question isn't whether telling him is the right thing to do. Maybe the question is how to tell him in a way that causes the least damage to everyone involved. Michael shook James's hand at the front door, and both men seemed to understand that this conversation had changed everything. There was no going back to ignorance, no pretending that David's paternity was a simple matter that could be resolved quietly between husband and wife. On the flight back to Detroit, Michael made his decision. He was going to tell David the truth, not to hurt Patricia or to satisfy his own need for honesty, but because David deserved to know where he came from and deserved the chance to decide for himself whether he wanted a relationship with his biological father. Patricia might never forgive him for this choice. Their marriage might not survive the complete exposure of her decades of deception. But Michael had realized something during his conversation with James Kellerman. Some relationships were worth destroying if they were built on lies, and some truths were worth telling regardless of the consequences. David Thompson was going to learn that the man he'd called Dad for 34 years wasn't his biological father. But he was also going to learn that Michael Thompson had chosen to be his father every single day, regardless of genetics, and that in Florida there was a man who'd wondered about him and worried about him and loved him from a distance for his entire life. The truth was going to hurt everyone involved, but Michael was finally ready to admit that living with lies hurt more. Michael Thompson sat in David's driveway for 15 minutes before finally working up the courage to knock on his son's front door. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April, and David was washing his car in the driveway, while his 8-year-old daughter Emma played hopscotch on the sidewalk, and his 5-year-old son Jake rode his bicycle in careful circles on the quiet suburban street. This was the life Michael had helped David build, a house in a safe neighborhood, a successful career that allowed him to spend weekends with his family, children who were growing up with the kind of stability and attention that David himself had enjoyed. In a few minutes, Michael was going to risk destroying all of it. "Grandpa Mike!" Emma shouted when she saw him getting out of his truck. She ran over and threw her arms around his waist, and Michael felt his resolve waver. These children loved him unconditionally, trusted him completely, and had never known a world where their grandfather wasn't exactly who he appeared to be. "Hey there, sweetheart," Michael said, hugging Emma tightly. "Where's your dad?" "He's washing the car. Mom's inside making lunch. Are you staying for lunch?" "I don't know yet. I need to talk to your dad about something first." David looked up from the Honda Civic he was meticulously cleaning and grinned at his father. At 34, David had grown into exactly the kind of man Michael had always hoped he would become: responsible, thoughtful, devoted to his family, and successful enough to provide them with opportunities that Michael's generation had only dreamed of. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you. Mom said you went to visit Uncle Tony in Cleveland." The lie came back to haunt Michael immediately. He'd told Patricia he was visiting his brother to cover for his trip to Florida, and Patricia had apparently shared that story with David. Another deception in a marriage that seemed to be built entirely on deceptions. "Actually, I went to Florida," Michael said. "I need to talk to you about that trip. Privately." David must have heard something unusual in his father's tone, because he immediately set down his sponge and turned to face Michael with concern. "Is everything okay? Are you sick?" "I'm fine, But there's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago." David glanced at his children, who were still playing nearby, then looked back at Michael with growing worry. "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? Can we go inside? This isn't a conversation for the driveway." David called to his wife Sarah, asking her to keep an eye on the kids, then led Michael into the house and down to the finished basement where they could talk without being overheard. Michael had helped David renovate this space when Emma was a baby, and they'd spent countless hours down here watching football games and talking about life. Now, it was going to be the place where Michael destroyed David's understanding of his own identity. "Dad, what the hell is going on? You look like someone died." Michael sat down on the couch where he'd held both of David's children as newborns, where he'd helped David prepare for job interviews and marriage proposals, where they'd shared some of the most important conversations of their relationship. "David, I need you to know before I tell you this that you are my son in every way that matters. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and nothing I'm about to say changes how much I love you or how proud I am of the man you've become." David's face went pale. "Jesus, Dad, just tell me." Michael took a deep breath and looked directly at his son, the young man he'd raised, coached, mentored, and loved for 34 years. "You're not my biological son." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. David stared at Michael for several seconds, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been betrayal. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your mother had an affair when she was pregnant with you, and your biological father is a man named James Kellerman." David stood up abruptly and began pacing around the small basement room. "That's not possible. Mom wouldn't. She's not that kind of person." "I thought the same thing. But she told me the truth 2 weeks ago, and I've confirmed it. James is still alive, David. He lives in Florida, and he's spent 34 years wondering about you." David stopped pacing and turned to face Michael with an expression of absolute devastation. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. Your mother told me at dinner one night, just casually mentioned, that I needed to accept her paternity fraud and move on with our lives." "She said that? Those exact words?" Michael nodded, watching his son process this information. David was an engineer, someone who approached problems logically and systematically. Michael could see him trying to fit these revelations into his understanding of his family, his parents, his own identity. "Does Mom know you're telling me this?" "No. She made it very clear that she didn't want you to know, that she thought it would only hurt you. And you decided to tell me anyway." Michael felt tears threatening. "David, you've been talking about doing those ancestry DNA tests, about researching our family history. You were going to find out eventually, and I thought it was better if you heard it from me." David sat back down, putting his head in his hands. "I don't understand how this is possible. I look like you, I act like you, I have your work ethic, your values. How can I not be your son?" "You do have my values because I raised you. You do act like me because you learned from watching me. But physically you look like James Kellerman. Once you know to look for it, the resemblance is unmistakable." "Have you met him? This James person?" "Yes. I flew to Tampa on Thursday and spent the afternoon with him." David looked up at his father with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and fear. "What's he like?" Michael thought about his conversation with James, about the man who'd made terrible choices but had tried to minimize the damage those choices caused to other people. "He's thoughtful, careful with his words. He made a mistake that hurt a lot of people, but he spent 34 years trying to do the right thing by staying out of your life." "Does he want to meet me?" "Yes. But he's more concerned with what's best for you than with what he wants." David was quiet for several minutes, staring at the floor while he processed everything Michael had told him. Finally, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "Dad, This doesn't change anything between us, does it? You're still my father. You're still Grandpa Mike to Emma and Jake." Michael felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. "David, nothing in this world could change how I feel about you. You are my son, period. Biology doesn't change 34 years of loving you." But it changes Mom's relationship with both of us." Michael nodded grimly. "Yeah, it does. How long was the affair?" 2.5 years. David's expression darkened. 2.5 years? She was cheating on you for the first 3 years of your marriage? According to James, yes. And she never told you, never felt guilty enough to confess? Apparently not. She seemed to think that keeping the secret was the noble thing to do, that it protected our family from unnecessary pain. David stood up and began pacing again, his engineer's mind working through the implications of what he'd learned. "Dad, this means our entire family history is a lie. Every story Mom told about when I was born, about our early years together, about how happy she was to be starting a family with you, all of it was fiction. Not all of it. I think your mother did love you, did want to be a good mother. But yes, the foundation of our family was built on deception. And James Kellerman, my biological father, he just went along with this, never tried to contact me. He was dealing with his wife's death when you were born, and Patricia convinced him that staying away was best for everyone. I think he's regretted that decision for 34 years. David stopped pacing and looked directly at Michael. "I want to meet him." Michael felt a mixture of pride and fear at his son's words. Pride because David was brave enough to face difficult truths. Fear because meeting James would complicate their family relationships in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. "Are you sure?" "Dad, I'm an engineer. I solve problems by gathering all available information and analyzing it systematically. Right now, I have incomplete information about my own identity, and that's not acceptable to me." Michael smiled, despite the gravity of their conversation. "That's exactly what I thought you'd say. Will you help me contact him?" "Of course, but David, we need to talk about your mother, about how this affects your relationship with her, and about what we tell Emma and Jake." David's expression hardened. "What we tell Emma and Jake is that their grandmother lied to their grandfather for 34 years and denied them the chance to know their biological grandfather. What we tell Mom is that her lies destroyed our family." "David, I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, Dad. I'm devastated. I'm heartbroken that the woman who raised me to value honesty and integrity built our entire family on lies, and I'm furious that she was willing to let you carry this burden alone rather than face the consequences of her own choices." Michael looked at his son and saw himself 34 years earlier, a man discovering that the person he trusted most had betrayed that trust in the deepest possible way. "What do you want to do?" David thought for a moment. "I want to call James Kellerman. I want to arrange to meet him, maybe bring Sarah and the kids so they can meet their biological grandfather. And then I want to have a very serious conversation with Mom about how her decisions have affected all of our lives. David, that's going to destroy your relationship with your mother." "Dad, my relationship with my mother was destroyed the moment she decided to base it on lies instead of truth. Finding out about those lies doesn't destroy the relationship. It just forces us to acknowledge that the relationship was never what we thought it was." Michael felt a deep sadness settling over him as he realized that his family was about to fracture in ways that couldn't be repaired. Patricia's decision to reveal her secret had set in motion a series of events that would reshape all of their relationships permanently. But he also felt a sense of relief that the truth was finally being told, that the lies that had defined their family for over 3 decades were being exposed and examined. Whatever happened next, it would be based on honesty rather than deception. "I'll call James tonight," Michael said. "I'll tell him you want to meet him and see if we can arrange something." David nodded, then looked at his father with an expression of gratitude and love that made Michael's chest tighten. "Dad, I need you to know something. Learning that you're not my biological father doesn't make you less my father. It makes you more my father, because it means you chose to love me and raise me every single day, regardless of genetics. That's not something that can be taken away or diminished by DNA tests or family secrets." Michael pulled his son into a hug, and they held each other for a long time in the basement, where Michael had taught David to throw darts and where they'd watched the Detroit Lions lose countless games together. "I love you, son," Michael said. "I love you too, Dad, and we're going to get through this together." Upstairs, Sarah was making lunch while Emma and Jake played in the backyard, unaware that their family had just fundamentally changed. In a few hours, David would tell his wife about James Kellerman, and together they would figure out how to explain to two young children that their family history was more complicated than they'd been taught. Patricia would learn about Michael's decision to tell David the truth when David confronted her directly, and their marriage would face its final test. After 35 years together, they would discover whether their relationship could survive complete honesty or whether it had been too dependent on lies and secrets to function in the light of truth. But in the basement of David's house, father and son sat together in the aftermath of revelation, understanding that their relationship, the most important relationship in both of their lives, was strong enough to survive any truth, because it was built on love rather than deception. The hardest conversations were yet to come, but Michael Thompson was finally ready to face them with the man he'd raised to value truth above comfort, integrity above convenience, and family above everything else. Biology might have made David someone else's son, but love and daily choice had made him Michael's, and that was a truth that no secret could change. The backyard barbecue at David's house looked like any other family gathering, except for the presence of a man who was both a stranger and completely familiar. James Kellerman sat at the picnic table, helping 8-year-old Emma with a jigsaw puzzle, while 5-year-old Jake showed him his collection of toy trucks, completely unaware that this quiet man from Florida was their biological grandfather. Michael stood at the grill, flipping burgers and watching this scene with a mixture of emotions he was still learning to navigate. 6 months after David's first meeting with James, their extended family had found a new equilibrium that nobody could have predicted. David and James had developed a cautious but genuine relationship, built on shared interests in engineering and construction, and on James's genuine desire to know his son without disrupting the family Michael had built. Sarah had welcomed James warmly, understanding that her children deserved to know all of their family history. Even Emma and Jake had adjusted to having 2 grandfathers with remarkable resilience. The only person missing from these new family gatherings was Patricia. The confrontation between David and his mother had been as devastating as Michael had feared. Patricia had been furious that Michael had betrayed her by telling David the truth, and David had been equally furious that Patricia expected him to live with her lies indefinitely. The conversation had ended with Patricia storming out of David's house, saying that if he chose to have a relationship with James Kellerman, he was choosing to destroy their family. Patricia had filed for divorce 2 weeks later, claiming that Michael's obsession with the past had made their marriage untenable. She'd moved in with her sister in Grand Rapids, the same sister who'd helped cover for her affair 34 years earlier, and had made it clear that she considered David's relationship with James to be a betrayal of everything she'd tried to build. Michael felt bad about the divorce, but he couldn't bring himself to regret telling David the truth. Their son had handled the revelation with grace and maturity, and his relationship with James was becoming one of the bright spots in an otherwise difficult year. "Dad," David said, walking over to the grill, "James wants to know if you need help with anything." Michael looked over at James, who was still patiently helping Emma with her puzzle. At 71, James moved a little slower than he once had, but he was clearly thriving on the opportunity to be part of David's family. He'd driven from Florida for this visit, and Michael knew he was planning to move to Michigan permanently to be closer to his son and grandchildren. "Tell him I've got it covered," Michael said, "but he can grab himself a beer from the cooler if he wants." David nodded, then looked at Michael seriously. "Dad, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Shoot. Are you okay with all of this? With James being part of our family? With Mom being out of the picture? With how everything has changed?" Michael considered the question while he watched James show Jake how to properly load dirt into his toy dump truck. 6 months ago, his life had been predictable and comfortable, built on routines and assumptions that had been proven false. Now his life was complicated and uncertain, but it was also built on truth and choice, rather than lies and obligation. "David, I'm sad about how things ended with your mother. I wish she'd been able to accept that keeping secrets for 34 years was wrong, and that telling you the truth was necessary. But I'm not sad that James is part of our lives now." "Really?" Michael nodded. "James is a good man who made a terrible mistake when he was young. He spent his entire adult life trying to minimize the damage that mistake caused to other people. He deserves the chance to know his son and grandchildren, and they deserve the chance to know him. And you're not threatened by his relationship with us?" Michael smiled. "Son, I raised you for 34 years. I taught you to drive, helped you with your homework, walked you down the aisle at your wedding, and held your children when they were born. James contributed DNA, but I contributed daily presence and daily choice to love you. There's no competition there." David grinned. "You know, that's exactly what James said when I asked him the same question. Smart man. Yeah, he is. And Dad, what? Thank you for telling me the truth. It was hard to hear, and it complicated our lives in ways we're still figuring out. But I'd rather deal with complicated truth than comfortable lies." Michael looked around the backyard at his family, his son and daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, the man who'd fathered David, but had graciously allowed Michael to be his father. It wasn't the family he'd expected to have when he'd married Patricia 35 years ago. But it was a family built on honesty and choice, rather than deception and obligation. "Me too, son," Michael said. "Me too." As the sun set over suburban Detroit, 2 grandfathers and their shared family sat around a picnic table, sharing stories and building new traditions. It wasn't the ending anyone had planned, but it was the beginning of something better, a family finally built on truth instead of lies, on daily choice instead of biological accident, on love that was strong enough to survive any revelation. Patricia had been wrong about one thing. The truth hadn't destroyed their family. It had just revealed which relationships were strong enough to survive honesty, and which had been too dependent on deception to function in the light of day. The ones that survived were worth keeping. The ones that didn't had never been real to begin with.